Hey there, my name is Cameron, better known as Venus Theory, and I'm very excited to be back with you here on the official Cubase YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be kicking off a brand new series all about making modern electronic music inside of Cubase, using the built-in instruments, features, and even samples in Cubase so that you can get started making music with the stuff that's right in front of you right now. In this series, I wanted to share with you a bit about my own approach and workflow when it comes to creating music, and we're going to break this down into three core parts. Today, in part one, we're going to be talking about how to get inspired, how to build an idea, and how to lay down the groundwork and the bones of a track to construct your session from. In part two, we're going to be talking more about arrangement and taking a loop and turning it into a full track and a full idea. And finally, in part three, we'll be talking about mixing, a little bit about mastering, and just generally finalizing a track to get it ready for release. Although the series will obviously heavily focus on electronic music production, I think many of these tips and ideas are applicable to just about any genre, and I hope that these tips are helpful as well for those of you who are looking to introduce some electronic music style elements into your next jazz, fusion, polka record, or whatever you might be making. If you want to catch parts 2 and 3 of this series as soon as they drop, don't forget to subscribe to the channel down below. And with that, I guess let's take a listen to a segment of the final product so you can get a sense of what we're going to be building throughout the course of this series. Here we are in Cubase, and this is the bare bones and foundation of the track that we're going to be breaking down, and this is how a lot of my sessions start. But before we start breaking down how I like to build these core elements, it's probably worth taking a moment to talk about how do you even get inspired and get an idea in the first place. This whole session actually started off as a remix, and I think that's a really easy way to get an idea and get something flowing in your session so you're not just sitting there staring at a blank DAW. For the sake of copyright, I can't show you the acapella that I used to start this session from, but it's a really easy thing to do. Just go online, look up some acapellas or some stems or something like that just to drag into the session and start piecing together the core idea. Although it might seem a little bit weird to start your sessions off by borrowing or even outright stealing ideas from other tracks, it's very easy to then get away from that. Once you build the core basis of the remix or whatever it is you're doing, you can take away those original elements you brought in and totally change the direction of the track and make something entirely original. There are a lot of other ways to get inspired for sessions, but I think that's one thing that's always really worked for me when I'm doing this type of music. Another great thing to do as well is simply to bring in a reference track and look at how it's constructed, where things change, and things like that to build your session and have a musical sketchpad, more or less, to build everything from. When it comes to getting started in this session, I think one of the first things I like to do is a little bit of sound design or just preset surfing, because I think in a lot of these styles of tracks, it comes down to that one memorable melody, hook, sound, sample, or whatever it is. So spending a little bit of time to find something interesting can give you a bit more of a kickstart to say, wow, that's really cool, and give you something to build the rest of the session around. For the sake of time here, we're not going to be doing everything from scratch, but I'm just going to break down the order of operations and how I typically work to get a session like this flowing. What really got this session started is just browsing around for some sounds inside of HALion Sonic here and the included flux synthesizer. So I found this sound called Dawn Destruction, and I think I changed just a few basic things like the wavetable and other things, and I got this sound out of it. Which is a really nice, modern, aggressive sound, and I think that really kickstarted this session to go, all right, cool, that's gonna be the main hook, and now I've established the whole idea that I want to lead up to. With most modern electronic productions, everything comes down to the drop, and this is really where I like to start things off. So once I found that sound, I knew that was going to be the basis of my drop, and from there it was just about stacking things vertically until I had a solid drop to work from. Although this isn't the case with every single session, starting from the drop I think is a great way to know the climax and I guess the end goal of the track. This is where everything is going to go, this is where all the stops get pulled, and this is the biggest, baddest, loudest point. And from there it's easy to extrapolate a bit and build other sections. So starting off with the drop is a pretty good way to, I think, get a solid foundation for the rest of your track. Once I had that lead figured out, that was going to be my hook, I figured it was probably time to start bringing in the drums and bass, because those are probably the two next most important elements in any modern electronic production. To get the drums going, I just went through the included loops and samples in Cubase and hunted around for a big fat kick sound as well as a couple of snares and claps to layer together to build a pretty basic but modern sounding drum kit. By stacking samples, you can get a more unique sound rather than just the same kick and snare. By stacking together a couple of snares and stuff, you can get something that's a little bit more interesting and pokes out in the mix. Once I had my elements, I just constructed a really basic rhythm. And that's really it. From there, I had the basic drum groove as well as the main lead, so I figured it was probably time to bring in a big, mean, growling 808. So I just made a super quick 808 here inside of REVerence 2. The long and short of 808 design is that typically 808s are made from sine waves, you then distort it, maybe add a filter, and you get that low, grumbling, growly thing. When you distort a sine wave though, it eventually starts to look like a square wave, so I've always found a fast way to make a nice 808 is to start with some big square waves, tune one up an octave, and then an additional 7 semitones to make a fifth, and then just lower the cutoff and add a bit of filter drive. From there, I had a nice, big, aggressive 808 to use as the low-end foundation of everything for the track. Putting all that together, I now had the main ingredients for a pretty heavy electronic drop. One really simple trick to make your mix slap and hit a lot harder is every time your 808 hits, you want to have a kick drum lined up with it, or at least most of the time. From there, I could just move a couple of these hits over and we would have a slightly different drum groove, but then these kick drums are going to hit a lot harder. With the kick and the 808 now lined up, we can take another listen to hear how that subtle alteration of the groove is just going to make things feel a bit heavier and more substantial. This way we've got a nice tight low end of the track and it's not just overblowing everything and feeling too chaotic and rumbly. To finalize the drums, I just brought in a couple of the hi-hat loops that are in the Cubase sample library and turned on musical mode. That way they stretch to fit the tempo of the track, and now we've got a pretty full drum section. To make this feel a bit more exciting and interesting, I wanted to layer up that lead synth, because on its own, it's pretty solid, but it could maybe use a little bit of help. So here in REVerence, I designed just a pretty basic bandpass super saw type sound with a bit of bit reduction and a good amount of resonance. If we take a listen to the lead in isolation, sounds pretty solid, but if we bring in that layer, it has just a slightly different feel that's a bit more exciting and full sounding. Building off of all this, I wanted something to enhance that sense of momentum and energy and a little bit of chaos maybe. So I brought in another sound here called Brave Chant, which is in Flux, and I did this thing called the blip lead. This is something you'll hear very subtly in the mix of a lot of modern tracks, or you might even hear something like just some noise put underneath things. This is just a little constant rhythm, just droning on the note. Doesn't really do anything, doesn't really go anywhere, but layering that with the lead, we get a bit more rhythmic interest, and it just fills in some of those gaps between the phrases. This is also a really good way to play off your hats and your bass, so if we take a listen to all those elements. We've got a pretty good basis of energy and momentum and something that feels like it's ready to be listened to. Because this is a festival trap style thing, I figured what festival trap track is complete without some big mean horns. I didn't have any good brass samples on hand, so I just made my own brass sound here with a bunch of saw waves FMing each other, and that created the final instrument section for the drop. Now, that all sounds pretty good, but it's not totally done yet. This is usually where I'll take things a couple of steps further just to make the sounds feel a bit more exciting and finalized. To make the lead sound a bit more interesting, I used REVerence here, which is a convolution reverb, and imported a snare and clap sample to use as the impulse response, which imparts a bit of a weird character onto the lead synth, but it actually sounds kind of cool. Almost sounds like it's coming through a tin can or something, and that just helps to drive home that sense of unique sound design stuff that makes these types of tracks stand out. Another really easy trick to make sounds feel a bit more modern is to feed them first into a reverb and then through Squasher, which is just a dynamics squashing tool that lifts up the quiet stuff and squishes down the loud stuff, so you get this just big, meaty sausage of a sound. So that takes that lead and turns it into this. Which just feels absolutely massive. To complement the main lead, I took a reverb and a delay and added that to the lead synth layer, which turns it into this. Just to make it feel a bit bigger and add a bit of groove to things and make it fill out the mix a bit more, because overall it's still kind of sparse. I've also done the same reverb into squasher trick for the blip lead as well as the brass, so that takes those sounds and turns them into this. It particularly makes the brass just feel super heavy, but it makes the blip lead just a bit more tight and controlled, and it also makes it just smack a little harder and poke through in the mix. To make life a bit easier later down the road, typically at this point I'll then take all of my instruments and feed them into an instrument bus, so I just took all these, right-clicked, went to add track, and then group channel to selected tracks. That way all these get fed into one track, which just makes mixing and some other stuff a bit easier, but we'll talk about that more later on. Closing off the sound design side of things, one thing that sort of bothered me, if we take a listen to these drums, I have this layer to the snare called the tone layer. This is something I usually recommend you do in these types of tracks because it's just a really common sound in like modern snare design. So you can take your snares and claps, stack them up and add like a tom or anything along those lines to add that kind of doof type tone to things. But if we listen a bit more critically to this alongside the instruments, it's maybe a little hard to hear, but it just doesn't quite match up. So what I did is bring in a frequency shifter. There are a lot of free frequency shifter tools out there that you can download to do this same process. I just brought in this one and tuned this sample up by 138 Hertz, and that takes that same tone layer and turns it into this. In the context of the drum section, it just pops a bit more, and in context with the instruments, it's just tuned a bit more and feels a bit more natural and sticks everything together rather than feeling like there's this one sample that doesn't quite fit in. At this point, we've now got the drop completed. We know where things are gonna go and where we wanna get to. Now it's just a question of how do we get there. So then typically I will take the elements of the drop, move them over, and just start deleting stuff in order to make the intro or maybe a mid section. Over here to the left, we have the intro. If we take a listen to that, it sounds like this. and that's the whole intro. I didn't really do anything all that interesting. I took the main lead and brought it over and then just added some automation to retrolog. So I automated the filter cutoff as well as the filter drive. I brought in the blip lead in the second half just to add some building and some tension. I brought the brass over, and that was pretty much the whole intro. By using elements that are identical or at least similar to elements in your drop, you add a sense of tension and anticipation, but it also just helps to glue the whole idea together, I think. However, there is something to be said for the power of contrast as well. So with that, I took some similar elements, but did a bit of contrast by changing the melody and the way they kind of feel and sound overall, as well as introducing a couple of new elements. The key difference in the intro here, I think, is the vocals, and that's really what establishes kind of the tone and flavor and the setup for the whole track. These vocals are actually from the Bloom pack, which is built into Cubase, and out of the box, they sounded like this. Which is pretty good, but it didn't totally fit and feel right. So to get that sense of modern hype, I did the usual go-to trick here of adding revelation followed by a squasher. And that really immediately made this jump out, and I think that was the key point in this session where I was like, okay, now I've really got something. There are a ton of different ways to process vocals to make them feel more interesting, so I'm not really gonna talk about that. I think it's more important that you go out and experiment and try stuff. What I did was just bring in this plugin, Vocal Synth 2 here, which is a combination of things like vocoders and formant shifters and stuff like that, and that just totally changed the character to be something that is a vocal, but also sounds a bit alien and unfamiliar. Combined with the revelation and the squasher, that just sounded super modern and super clean and really brought this intro together. So cool, we're basically done. One final thing I'll do with sessions like this when I'm starting things off is add in some transitions and effects just to start to sell the idea to myself. So I've added in a bunch of impacts and sweeps and downlifters and risers and all sorts of other stuff. And if we take a listen to those in isolation, it sounds like this. Right there, we're just dropping some energy. We're in the track. And now we're building up because stuff's gonna start changing. And it stops and boom, comes back in. I think you get the idea. Then here I've added some different transitions, a little bit of contrast once again. And we get that tension and release and tension and release and stuff like that. So if we listen to that in context with the mix, this really starts to sell the idea. We start off with this big punchy kick and this big impact. We're dropping the listener into the world of the track. We're building up some tension here before these other drums start coming in. Another drop. Then I brought in one different sound here just to add a little bit of contrast, something different to indicate to the listener that something new is coming. I also brought in some extra snare samples here to build some pacing and tension. And now we've, built that up, we've paused, we give them a breather, and then we drop things in. The final effect to talk about here is the little hook that comes in right before the drop. It's a copy of those vocals, just pitched down and with the formant scaled a little bit differently. And that really just makes things feel like, all right, something's gonna happen, and then the drop comes in. The final trick I've employed here is just one quick bit of automation to mute the entire instrument bus, and this way we get a bit of a breather right before things come in, because otherwise, if we don't have this happening, these instruments bleed over and kind of mask that vocal sample, and there's not as much tension and pause before the drop comes in. So we don't have that sense of like, and boom. So by just muting that entire instrument bus right before the drop hits, just feels a little bit cleaner, a little bit more punchy, and starts to bring the whole idea together. And that is a look at how I often start most of my sessions. Although this isn't really my usual style, I think it just goes to show that if you lay down a couple of basic ideas, it's pretty easy to then build a fuller idea from and really kick your sessions off right. That wraps everything up for part 1 here. In part 2, we're going to be talking about taking this loop and turning it into a full track and a full idea, and then we're going to talk about mixing, mastering, and finalizing the track to get it ready to release. That's all I got for this one, so thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel down below for more videos just like this one and news about all things Cubase. And of course, as always, I hope this inspires you to get out there and make something awesome.